Hey everyone, and welcome back to Volunteer Friendly. This is episode 16, What is Calling Anyway? Volunteer Friendly is a podcast for worship leaders, production managers, tech leaders, anyone really involved in making Sunday happen. And the goal of Volunteer Friendly is each week, each episode is less than 10 minutes. And the goal is to provide a question, a thought-provoking thing, maybe even a controversial thing that really makes you have to slow down, stop, and contemplate this on your own, and then eventually to discuss with your team. And that's really the goal of this content, is to make us think about what we're doing, to not just say yes and not just do things because we've always done them, but to really think about them. Today's topic is going to be interesting. And I've had a lot of conversations with people since I've been in ministry, really since I was a teenager to even now at the age of 35. A lot of conversations with people that describe this differently and think of this differently. But here's my question to you. What is calling anyway? This is something that we discuss a lot in church context. And I really want to talk about it in the context of job things, right? When it's related to a church, people say, do you feel called to this place? People will say, do you feel called to be a worship leader? That's lingo and language that we often use, even when working with volunteers, even with building a worship team, building people to be worship leaders at your church in your particular scenario. Maybe you even use that. Maybe during a rehearsal process of not an interview, but when people come in and audition. There we go. That's what I was looking for. During the audition process, if you do that, maybe you say, hey, why do you feel called to lead worship? And maybe some people have gotten caught off guard because I think if you're outside of the church, it's not a term you often use, unless you're someone who's maybe a little more entrepreneurial. You read a lot of business books. You're really into the idea of pursuing your dreams, pursuing your calling. It's not just a in-church word, but it's a word I hear a lot discussed with staff things, with decisions about should someone be a part of this? Are they called to this? So I really think the idea is interesting. What is calling anyway? What does it mean to be called to a place? What does it mean to be called to a different role? Again, I try really hard in the show to not share my personal opinions. Volunteer Friendly is not a platform for my personal ministry philosophy. God knows no one needs that. But I have seen scenarios where a church, fires someone gets let go. They're a bad employee. Maybe they even do something, morally wrong. And churches are so spectacular at covering up failures and things that people have done wrong. And instead of saying, we fired Will because he's a lazy bum who drinks too much coffee and sits around and records podcasts all day. Well, instead of saying that, what do you hear? Will has been called to another role. Will has been called to another state. I talk with friends all the time that are stuck at churches, that are miserable, that don't like it. And I go, man, when are you going to move? When are you going to get a new job? I don't know. I still feel called to this place. And I'm like, well, one, who's calling you? Because you need to stop answering the phone. And two, it's like, what does that even mean? Like, do you feel called to a place that's very toxic and terrible and doesn't treat you well and that you hate and you complain about all the time, but you said you feel called there. I have this conversation a lot of times with folks when it comes to moving, to leaving a place, to getting a new role. And people go, I don't like my job. It's not great here. Something's going wrong or whatever. And they go, I think I'm feeling called somewhere else. It's just an interesting concept. It's an interesting word that we often use, but I don't think we take the time to define it. Is calling something that is constant? Is calling something that changes? I talked to a friend, a couple days ago now at the time of recording this, and he was talking about, I forgot the exact verbiage he used in the way he described this, but he was basically saying, I'm going to butcher this, but we essentially were having the conversation, is calling constant for your whole life or does calling change? But what you mean by calling might be something different than I mean, right? And so we might be going, yeah, you're wrong. But then we go, oh, you say calling, I mean job. You say calling, I mean what God has commanded me to do, right? And so you may see those as different things. Here's the thing I always go back to. Again, Gosh, I try so hard not to put my personal opinion in this, but here's one thing I want to share. This is something my wife and I have been discussing a lot recently is we personally are, as we're praying through things, as we're asking God for wisdom, we really feel like calling has less to do with the place you are and the thing you do, and has more to do with your heart and your relationship with Jesus, right? Calling, we believe, has more to do with that than the place you are and the thing you're doing. We personally feel like you could be in a different place doing a different thing, but Jesus, again, we feel like is more concerned with your heart and your relationship with him. But I want you to take some time and I want you to figure this out. And a way that we do this on Volunteer Friendly is each week, each episode, again, less than 10 minutes, I provide you with 3 questions. I call these 3 processing questions. But the goal of these 3 questions is for you to contemplate these on your own. And I think this is going to take quite a bit of contemplation, before you share this, and then share this with your team. Maybe it's a staff team. Maybe it's a small group. Maybe it's your band before a rehearsal. I hope this is a great utility for worship leaders out there to kind of provide something that makes their team really think, and then discuss this together. And a way to make this easy is each week we create a PDF of these questions that you can download and work through with your team. There's space to write these down. And I would highly encourage you to download these, kill some trees and print paper, because I think having these and writing these down, maybe even store them in a journal, is going to become super, super beneficial and is really going to help you to, one, contemplate on your own and discuss with your team. So let's get to today's 3 questions. You'll find that PDF in the description of this video, show notes of this podcast, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to volunteerfriendly.com is where you can get those, the PDF of those downloads. So download those and let's walk through these questions. Okay. Number 1, how do you describe God's calling? What does God's calling mean? When you say calling, what exactly does that mean? How do you exactly refer to that? 2 different people, 4 different people in a group are all going to think of different things. Define that. How do you describe God's calling? So number 1, how do you describe God's calling? I think that'll be good. Take this personally and then discuss with your team and see what everyone comes up with. Number 2, is calling constant or is it variable? Is calling constant or does it change? Okay, let's say it that way. Is calling constant or does it change? Again, hopefully you define calling in number 1. If you're following along, you did. You said, this is what I feel like, how I describe God's calling. And then number 2, you said, you answer the question, is calling constant or does calling change? Is calling constant or does calling change? Number 2. Number 3, are you being called to a different place or a different role? Number 3, are you being called to a different place or a different role? Again, based on number 1, how you define it, based on number 2, what you believe about if it's constant or does calling change, depends on how you get to number 3, which is, are you being called to a different place or a different role? Again, click the link in the description of this video. Click the link in the show notes of this podcast to download those PDF questions, contemplate them on your own, process them with your team. And I would love to hear what comes of that and what you get out of it. Now, a final thing I'd love to ask you to do, think of one person that you think would enjoy this podcast, that would benefit from it. Maybe a fellow worship leader, a fellow team member you want to walk through this with. Shoot them a text and say, hey, check this out. I think you would enjoy this. Maybe even encourage them to have this conversation with you. But regardless, thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next Thursday, 10 a.m. Central. That's when we post new episodes, new podcasts here on the Volunteer Friendly Show. Take care, everybody. Bye.